Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Danny Topolsky, and I'm here with Peter McInnes, who is with us to talk about performance and optimization in Spotfire for our August Dr. Spotfire session. I'm also joined by Jose and Athir from the Dr. Spotfire team. Hi, team. How's everyone doing today?
Hello, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
All right. So before we get started, just a couple of quick announcements. First is that myself, Danny Topolsky, Athir Alatar, and Jose are the new Dr. Spotfire team. The three of us are excited to continue to share and discuss Spotfire topics and tips and tricks for the Spotfire community. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel for recorded sessions and quick tip videos. Our monthly Dr. Spotfire sessions are the first Tuesday of every month. The next announcement is about the Analytics Forum coming up September 19th through the 21st. This is a free digital event that highlights industry megatrends in visual analytics, data management, data science from industry leaders. The forum also showcases practical use cases and expert tips and tricks from data analytics pros. And it's a free digital event. It'll have a number of breakout sessions, customer-led sessions, and a 24-hour hackathon. Athir, do you want to talk a bit about the hackathon?
Yeah, sure. Let me, okay. I'm trying to share my, yeah.
There we go.
Thank you. So this year, the hackathon is about using the data to mitigate the food deserts in the city of Houston. This is the official hackathon page. You can go through to know more details about the background of the problem and then how you can prevent that using the data. The hackathon will be on September 21st. And we have all the details here, the judging criteria, and then how to register to the hackathon. We're also providing free training sessions before the hackathon starts. So in case if you need a refreshing to your Spotfire information, you can attend these training sessions, and all the details are on the website. To register to the hackathon, it's easy. You just go to the TAF registration page. And then once you fill in the information, you just express your interest in attending the hackathon, whether or not to attend the training, and then you'll be contacted later on. So this is all about the hackathon. I will share all the links and details in the comment section, or you can simply follow any of us on LinkedIn to know more details. Thank you, Danny.
All right, thanks, Athir. All right, so for today's Dr. Spotfire session, this is the third part of a series brought to us by Peter discussing the Spotfire platform in the enterprise. And remember, our Dr. Spotfire motto is learning is not driven by answers, but by questions. So feel free to participate and ask questions along the way in the chat. And now I will turn it over to Peter to get started on today's topic.
Thank you, Danny and team. So I'm going to go through the last kind of session about the enterprise platform today. We'll be talking about monitoring performance and scalability. So in case I say anything forward-facing, I don't think I will, but so what can you learn from this session? So first off, we're going to talk about monitoring. So there's a lot of ways to monitor the platform. We'll see some of those today. It's important to monitor the platform so then you can know whether you should be concerned about the performance and when you should scale and size your environment appropriate. And then there's a slide at the end that has various links to resources. So let's get started. So the first thing is there's many ways to monitor the Spotfire platform. There's lots of different information. There's the Spotfire administration console. You have access to that. There's performance metrics that are recorded. There's various logs and recorded, and we'll go through some of those. There's also on the analyst side, and we'll look at this briefly, there's also logs available on the analyst side too, to help you figure out what's going on there. So let's just jump right in. So first off, I'm an administrator in my environment, so I've logged in here to the web administration console, and I'm going to go to the main place we're going to look at today is this monitoring and diagnostics. And so this gives you a kind of a snapshot of what's going on right now. You can see I have one Spotfire server, a couple of nodes, and then some web player instances as well down here. And again, this gives you a snapshot of available memory, CPU usage. You can see there's not much usage right now. I'm actually running a test just to give me a little more activity on it. But again, there's not much going on here. It's just a very simple environment. But from here, you can make various modifications. Like I can modify the Spotfire server. I can set the debug levels or the logging levels, so the standard or a debug or other ones. I can also go out and view the logs for the Spotfire server. And this, there's many logs in the logs directory, but this hops me onto the server.log, which is probably the key log for the Spotfire server. It can be hard to view the logs in this interface, but if you know of an issue that maybe just occurred, you can scroll down to the bottom and kind of see what happened. But also you can download the full log file here as well, and that'll help you. You can then manipulate it in your editor of choice locally. Another thing that's important from this is to download the troubleshooting bundle, and that's important because that's a lot of times the support team uses that to kind of gives a snapshot of all the whole environment, all the nodes and the web player instances and things like that, and it gives you a very good overview of what's going on in the environment. The other thing I can do here is I can, if I go over here to the list of here, so I can look at the server diagnostics. So this, again, this gives a snapshot of the server. I can also see what data sources have been in use and which ones are available, which drivers are available as well. So that gives me a kind of a snapshot of the current environment. Just point out here, you can see this can be important if you have if you're like maxing out your connections. And again, and these are the backend data sources. So these are the sources that Spotfire server is connecting to, including the Spotfire database, which is listed right here. So these might, if you're having issues with data sources, this is one place to look. You can see if you're maxing out the connections. So if we go back to the overview, the other thing is you also have the ability to change the log configuration for the various nodes. You can also view the logs here. If I select a web player instance, I can sit here and view the logs. And again, this takes you to the most important log, which is this Spotfire DXP worker host debug. And this is the instance ID of the instance that we're looking at. So in this case, you can also see all the various logs that are in the directory. And again, it might be hard to view the log in here, but if you know of something that just happened, you can look for that error and then quickly get a view of what's going on. The other thing you get in here is kind of a view of the instances. Again, this is all real time, what's going on right now. So it's not it won't give you much historical information, but it'll give you, say, you can see who's using what in the environment. So if I switch to the other web player, you can see that there's the users that are being utilized, the analysis that's being utilized, and then you can see performance metrics down here. Again, this is a snapshot of the performance right now. And we can see where the state of the system is right now. If there's enough memory, how CPU is doing, and things like that. So a couple other things. If you do have access to the backend, to the servers themselves, so this is a Spotfire server machine, version 12.0. You can see the bunch of log files. This is the log directory we looked at for Spotfire server, and you can see down here's the server.log file. Some of the other log files in here that you may look at times is the performance monitoring log, and this log is only available if the Spotfire server is set to debug logging, and this gives performance metrics. So again, it's performance counters, memory, CPU, and other sessions, things like that. The other log that I find useful in here is a SQL log, and so this gives the SQL that is run by information services, the actual query that's sent to the data sources. So this can be useful if you're having to debug or see what's going on with an actual query that's being run. Again, there's a lot of other logs in here. Sometimes you might need to look at them as well. Spotfire server runs on the Apache Tomcat. So some of these are actually, if you're familiar with Tomcat, they're Tomcat logs that are visible in there. So this machine here that I'm in actually is running the node manager. So this is where the logs are for the node manager. Again, if you have physical access to the machine, and you can see there's a whole long list of logs again. Again, the worker host debug log that we looked at, and this is the instance ID that I'll show it in the web view in a minute. And then here's the performance counter log, which is also useful in the web player. Again, so these are historical logs. So these can give you the metrics over time, whereas on the view in here, you just get a snapshot. Right here, this is the beginning of the instance ID. So this will map back to the back end to the log file you'd be interested in if you're aware of which instance something occurred on, or if you want to get more details about that. So that matches to the to this, this ID right here. You can see that it starts with the E69. That's how you can match it to the instance it's running. The last thing that I'll look at as far as here is the logs for the Spotfire analyst, which will be useful at times. So if you go over under help, support diagnostics and logging. Typically these aren't turned on. Typically these are set to none, typically when you go in here. But oftentimes if you need to find out information about what's going on in the analyst, you will want to set these debug. And then you can open the folder where these logs are. You can see there's several logs here. There's this is the main one. And then there's also this query log, which I'll show open in Notepad++. This gives the queries that are run by the data connector. So if you're running data connectors, this can be helpful if you're trying to debug connections from the Spotfire analyst to the analysis. To the data sources in the back end. So now we'll go back to I have some. I clicked on the link. Hold on. Hold on. Oops. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so sorry about that. Yeah, so these are links in the slides to the actual analyses, and we went through this. So the slides kind of back up what we were talking about. So I don't need to go through those in specific. Like I said, so yeah, the Spotfire server important log files, the node manager log files. One of the things I didn't point out was the node manager log. So we talked about these two logs. The node manager log is important if you're having issues with the node manager or web player instances starting up. Because that shows kind of what's going on when the node manager is starting up before the web player automation services or other service instances start up. So there you can find information about communication with Spotfire server. And usually you don't look at that again after you've configured the environment or have it running, but it is useful to look at that when you're starting up. So now I'm going to flip back over just for a second to look at user action logs. So the user action logs record quite a bit of information, or can if you enabled them in your Spotfire server environment. So they give you, they record all sorts of information about what the users are doing in the environment, what admins are doing in the environment, scheduled updates and automation services. And again, these are typically recorded in a database, and then you can put a Spotfire analysis file on top of them. It comes with a Spotfire analysis file and an information model that you can use. And this just kind of gives you a snapshot of what's going on over time. So, and obviously, since it's a Spotfire analysis file, you can manipulate it as needed. So, for example, again, this is just sessions, users over time. You can get information about the Spotfire library usage as far as analysis files and information links, and it goes on and on. I'm not going to go through all these slides or all these tabs, but again, you get a lot of information here. I will point out, you get some high-level monitoring information. So you get some information about what's going on in the Spotfire server, as well as the web player monitoring. Again, this isn't as detailed as the performance metrics you get, but if you need just a kind of a high-level overview of what's going on, you can kind of see, obviously, memory goes up and down during the day, or sessions do as users go off and on and off your environment. So the user action logs are really critical. It's useful to turn those on. You can get historical information, so you can see how analysis files might have changed over time as far as the size of the data that they use, or the speed of loading, or how many users are using an analysis file. Or users actually using an analysis file that's in your environment. That's really critical because you can see the user activity. So it's a useful environment. It's a useful tool to, again, get historical information. when you set it up, you need to make sure that the you don't, you set a good pruning, what's called a pruning period. So, you keep it historically maybe for a year or for 6 months or however much time. The data is not that much because it's only recording when the user's doing something. So the user clicks on a button, they filter something, they change pages, they open an analysis, or an admin does something. It records what's going on at that time. So one of the things that's useful about we'll talk about performance and scalability and things, but another thing that's useful with logs is troubleshooting something. So one of the examples that I come up with is data flow. So you have my data's slow, my data's not loading that fast, things like that. So the first thing is you can look at the log files. So as we talked about for information services, so those are the connections that go from Spotfire server via JDBC to the data source. The SQL log is useful for the exact query that's being run to the source with filters and stuff filled in, and then also has timings, and then also the server.log if there's an actual error occurring. You can look in there to see if there's get a good trace of what's going on. With data connectors, as we saw, you have the analyst logs and the web player logs if it's something that's happening on the web player. And then action logs, again, can tell you what's happened over time. So, maybe this data loaded in, 10 minutes a couple of weeks ago, but now it's taking an hour to load. Is there more data? Did something, what else, did something happen? And then also the last thing is just, problem solving. So, break down the problem. Is there network latency? Is it the query taking longer? Is it using up more memory? So do you have the same issue on the web player and the node manager? And then, is there any other tool that you can use to set up a query, to run the SQL? One of the things, to be careful with there is that there are tools. A lot of the tools that you run a query and may only pull back a subset of the data, so you don't get the full set of data coming back. Also testing network speed, so copying a similar size file across the network to simulate the data pool to see, is it a network latency issue? And then also the last kind of thing to be aware of, if you're running out of memory, Spotfire will start writing data to disk. Now it'll still be able to work, but it'll be slower. So, if the data isn't fitting in memory, then it'll start writing to disk, and that'll slow things down as well. So yeah, I'll pause and see if there are any questions. I don't see any so far, but so now we'll move on to performance and.
So Peter, you mentioned about the. Oh no, sorry. Yeah, the application profiler that's also consuming the logs, right? And it's a dashboard that you show. The application profiler.
The application profiler is
the application profiler, right? That you can.
Yeah, that's a little bit different thing. That's available in. Oops. Oh, I don't have it. I don't have. Oh no, sorry. That's I get confused. That's in the web. That's under diagnostics here. That allows you to run something across all the subset or all the analyses in the Spotfire library. And so this can also give you some information over time. This opens the analysis files, can do different things with it depending on what you want it to do. And then you get a Spotfire data files out of it as well as an analysis so you could view over time. This is useful a lot of times in upgrades to make sure analysis files are still working. But you can also use it to see the performance over time with analysis files. But this does require a machine that sits there and opens the analysis files. So it actually has to open the analysis files, which means pulling down the data and things like that. Whereas the action logs kind of can give similar information over time. Obviously, this is useful maybe in a new environment when you're upgrading, like I said, or things like that. You can test to make sure things still work. Is that what you're thinking about, Jose? Or? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, so moving on. So now we're going to go through some things about performance and scalability. So the Spotfire environment is, highly scalable, especially with the idea of kind of the worker nodes, the web player, you can, and then the rules you can set up. You can partition analysis files. You can scale up or out, adding multiple workers and then, multiple Spotfire servers if needed. You can partition, mission critical reports and ad hoc users. And then you can also cache, various, data if needed. So we're going to go through some of these things and kind of what ties into performance and things like that. So first off, one of the first things that is important about scaling is how is the data being consumed? Is it in memory? Is it kept external? In which case, only a small subset of the data is brought in, and only the queries are run in the data source. I guess before we go into on-demand external data, you almost need to be concerned about scaling your data source almost sometimes more, because that's where the data, that's where the queries are going to be run when the user's interacting with the analysis file. And then you have on-demand, where you bring a subset of the data into Spotfire. And then you have streaming data, which is constantly sending data to Spotfire and viewing that. And kind of at a high level, there's kind of generalizations. Obviously, in specific use cases, the memory and CPU impact will be different. But as a general case, obviously, if you're pulling the data into memory, it can have a large impact on memory. Again, that's depending on the size of the data. And then obviously, the CPU impact can be smaller because you already have the data in memory. You're not processing the data every time the user does something. But it can, that depends on what you're doing with the data. If you're having, large amount of complex calculations, obviously that, affects the CPU. For external data, usually the memory impact is smaller because, again, you're pulling back just the data for the visualizations. But the CPU impact can be a little bit higher because, you're pulling that data back, Spotfire's processing it, and then displaying it as the user's interacting with it, rather than all being in memory and just doing everything right there. On demand, typically it's small because you're pulling back, the concept behind on demand is to pull back a small subset of the data, just a subset that you're interested in drilling down in, from another analysis or visualization. And then streaming data typically can have a larger impact, especially on CPU, because it depends on the rate that you're getting that data, but you're obviously constantly redrawing that visualization as the data gets, or every seconds, 1 second, 2 seconds, depending on 10 seconds, depending on how you set the streaming rate. There's actually a good article on the community about streaming data and how that affects sizing of an environment and everything. That's listed in the resources. So you have memory, and then scaling considerations when you're actually pulling the data into memory. One way you can kind of measure this, or at least get an estimate of what's going on. So if you have the Spotfire analysis already available, you can estimate the RAM. So you can pull up Task Manager in Windows. You can look at what the Spotfire program starts out at as far as memory usage. You can open an analysis, interact with it a little bit maybe, and then see what the memory is used up. So in this case, we start off about 200 meg. We go up to about 2.1, 2.2 gigs, and then if you do the calculation there, you end up with about 2 gigs for the data. So in Spotfire, there's kind of two types of memory usage, especially on the web player. On the analyst, obviously it's your own machine; it's only you running. But on the web player, there's the data, the raw data, maybe the base calculations and stuff. And then on top of that, there's the user data. So the user's interacting with the analysis file. They're filtering, they're marking, maybe they're running some calculations, maybe doing some scripting, things like that, based on what's been in the analysis file. So that user data is kind of is added on top of the raw data, and that way you can get kind of a base calculation of what the size of an analysis might take up if you had X number of users, come onto the system. So in this case, I give a little sample here. Typically, the memory needed for user data is typically 40 to 80 megs. Of course, obviously, it totally depends on the analysis complexity. Spotfire is very flexible in what you can do with it. So really depending on that, will depend on how much data that is. But that's typically what I've seen. So in this case, I just take the midpoint and did the average and did 60 megs. So if you have start off with 2 gigs of data of kind of the raw data, and then you have 6 gigs of user data, So, you're estimating about 8 gigs for this analysis file. So that's kind of just a high-level view. Obviously, it gives you a good estimate of what analysis will take, but obviously, when it's being used, that would be more exact. But again, you can't. It's hard to get exact because you don't know exactly what's going to be going on and everything. But this gives you a good estimate that's useful.
Right, and you also need to take into consideration. You also need to take into consideration, Peter, the number of users accessing the dashboard and things like that. And also on a large enterprise or global environment, you have to have. It's recommended to have multiple web players or nodes, right? So it can improve the performance.
Right. So you can, split this analysis or, all your analysis across various web players. And we'll talk a little bit about the resource pools in a little bit and how to do the routing on that. But yeah, so you can have, maximum control over, the various, where you can route analysis files. But yeah, it's in a large environment, you're going to have multiple web player instances, with multiple analysis files on them. One thing that's kind of, interesting with data or kind of difficult with data, it's kind of hard to say, I have X amount of, columns and rows and, what's that going to be in memory? Well, you don't really know until you get into the memory because it can really vary. One of the key things is it's not just the number of rows. A lot of times people ask about the number of rows in a data set. Well, you could have 1 million rows with, 100 columns or 1 million rows with, 9 columns or something. And then you get a different, obviously, one of the key things is the number of cells. So, and also what's in the cells, is it numeric, is it character? The other thing that Spotfire is really good about compressing data. So the entropy of the data really affects how much memory it takes. So the entropy is, how many unique or how many unique columns how many unique values are in a column. So if you have a lot of unique values in a column, that column's going to take up a lot more space than something with few unique values. So this is kind of just in here to give you a sense of, it's not always, you can't just say it. And it's also hard to say like, well, it takes X amount in the database. It's going to take X amount in Spotfire. It's kind of hard, before you have an analysis file to kind of estimate how much, memory it's going to take up. Because again, it really depends on the types of the columns, the data, and things like that. And then also, what's going on in the analysis file can affect it as well. How many tabs you have, number of filter schemes, things like that. So again, you can kind of give a sense of what an analysis file might use up, but again, it's hard to get an exact number from it. So this kind of just give you a sense of information about that. So kind of stepping back into the analysis. So the Spotfire analyses also affect scaling and performance. So think about the web player, the number of analyses you're going to have loaded, what's the largest analysis in memory, and then the complexity of the analyses like we've been talking about, calculations, scripting, and all that can affect the CPU load. And then can you load it by scheduled updates? So in this, one of the previous sessions, we talked about scheduled updates, so I'll just take a brief moment. So scheduled updates allows you to schedule analysis files in Spotfire, in the web player, so that when a user goes in and opens it up, they don't have to wait for the data to load. Obviously, this takes up memory, but it makes it really, it saves on CPU, by not having to load the file for each user. But again, it does use up memory. The scheduled updates is highly recommended for analyses that are used a lot, like by hundreds and lots of users, and also important analyses. For example, executive reports or critical reports where people don't want to sit there and wait for them to load. And we'll talk a little about other places to cache. This is one place to cache, and it's easy to do. And I'll show scheduled updates that I have set up later on. And also, when you're creating the Spotfire analyses, is also can the data be shared by users? Is this an analysis in which I'll be looking at similar data to someone else, and so that Spotfire is going to share that data behind the scenes and not use as much memory. So moving on, so the next thing, so we talked about the analyses, and then we're going to start talking about the server, the backend server component. So we have the Spotfire server. what's related to scaling Spotfire server. So the number of current connections, via information services. Again, the information services are connections from Spotfire server to the data source. Typically, these aren't, in most environments, you don't have that many at a time, but I've seen use cases where, an analysis file, the front screen of an analysis file is set up to kind of do an on-demand back to, tens of information links at one time. So that's important to know that if that's what you're going to be doing, how many users may be using that at one time. A number of concurrent users in consumers and business authors, and some extent, again, analysis. The analyst users don't really use Spotfire server that much. I mean, they connect to it to log in, to get stuff from the library, to run information services, do stuff in the library, but they don't typically, they're doing everything on their machine with the analysis and not communicating much with Spotfire server. But the consumers and business authors, everything they do when they click a button, that HTTP traffic goes through Spotfire server, and then goes to the web player and streamed back through Spotfire server. Is there a need for high availability? Do you need to have more than one, Spotfire server so you can have failover in case one of them goes down? Is streaming data used? Again, this will increase the amount of HTTP traffic that's being used because that traffic is going through the visuals are getting updated. And what do you scale with Spotfire server? Well, you can scale up additional memory and CPUs. You can increase the JVM memory. There's some backend settings. Max jobs and thread pool size. There's articles about this that you can look at, but these control how many information services jobs and other server work can go on at once. Typically, if you're increasing the JVM, you can increase those as well and handle more information services and other workload at one time. You can also scale out and add additional Spotfire servers. It's really easy to. They're all using the same Spotfire database, so the configuration is already in the Spotfire database. So you just install the server, configure it, bootstrap it, use the existing database, and then you're can get that configuration. If you do have multiple Spotfire servers, you need a load balancer with sticky sessions enabled in front of it. And then, Spotfire servers don't tend to be too large, maybe 6 to 8 cores, 16 to 48 gigs. Again, I've seen places where they're larger than this, but it really depends on, again, it depends on the environment. Most customers have, especially enterprise customers have, 2 or more, 3, 4 Spotfire servers. Obviously, smaller customers, can get by with 1 unless they need high availability, and then you would have 2 right out the bat.
Quick question, Peter. So deciding what to scale up kind of just depends on some of these bullet points that you have at the top of the slide. So when deciding like what to scale, whether to scale up or out, it kind of just depends on, what are the needs and kind of what are the different components to your Spotfire environment.
Yeah, correct. So it's what's going on in the environment. Typically, Spotfire server again doesn't need to scale as much as the web player. So typically, whether you have multiple Spotfire servers depends on the size of the environment as far as the number of users using it, number of web players, and whether you need high availability or not.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah, and then the web player is a little bit different. The web player is a little bit harder to figure out the exact scale. Obviously, over time, if you have an environment, you can know, but some of the same things apply here. But concurrent active web player users, typically, sometimes you can get this. If you have a total number, if you're trying to size something before you have an environment, or something before you even know who's going to be using it, maybe you have an estimate of the total number of users. Typically, we think about 10 to 20% of total users can be concurrent. But again, that depends on your use cases. Do you have a report at the beginning of the month that everybody's going to look at, or things like that? And again, the largest analysis file needed in memory, like if you have an analysis takes up 30 gigs of memory, then you need at least one web player node that can handle that. Your web player nodes can be different sizes. Again, that will lead to you managing where you put various analyses. And again, we'll look at the resource pooling and some of that in a little bit. As we've talked about multiple times, complexity of analyses, whether the data can be shared will affect memory. Again, use of scripting, use of scheduled updates, the volume of data, and again, how the data will be consumed, in-memory, external data on demand, and then streaming. The web player is the harder one of these if you're trying to, it's not harder to scale, but it's the harder one to figure out, like from the beginning, like how much do you need. Typically, unless you need to know from the get-go how big your environment is. I mean, many years ago, and I've been doing this a long time, but it used to be people wanted to know how big their environment needed to be for 3 years or something. But now with VMs and even like with Kubernetes and things, containerization and things like that, it makes it a lot easier to scale up faster or scale out faster by adding another machine and things like that. So you don't necessarily need to know from the get-go how big your environment needs to be. So you can start off small and then grow as needed.
I have a question,
Yeah,
Peter.
go ahead.
How to get the user action log dashboard, and whether or not if it's ready-made dashboard or we need to make it.
There's one that comes with it's used if you have the Spotfire server installation zip file in the database of your choice. So Oracle and SQL Server, they come with an information model. Postgres doesn't come with the action log information model, but there's if you search the community site for the Postgres, you'll find the action log information model for there. And within the information model, there's an analysis file, a base analysis file that hooks up to that information model. And then obviously you can because it's Spotfire, you can do whatever you want to with it. You can modify it, make it better, things like that. The base one's kind of a base one to begin with, but it brings the data in. I guess another thing about action logs. The action logs, all the data is in one table, but the information model has a bunch of views on top of it, so you can get to specific what we call action categories. So you can get to information model library loading or library loading of an analysis file, things like that, pretty easily. Yeah. So back to web player scaling and scale up, additional memory and CPUs. With the web player, you don't want to make it, because of how it's using .NET and memory, you don't necessarily want to make web players really large. I mean, but usually it's better to do additional web player instances so they can manage the memory better in .NET. And sometimes if you do have very large web player instances, you can add additional web player instances on the same node, which will help with the throughput. Because again, there's no way to say this web player instance just take this amount of memory and this other web player instance just take this amount of memory, but just they'll be sharing the memory, and each of them will managing less memory in total. And you can scale out, add additional web player nodes. And again, that's pretty easy to do. You just install the node manager. You can make all this stuff can be automated as well. So you don't have to do it manually, but you can trust what you do is trust the node, and then you push the web player or automation services instance to it. Web player nodes tend to be larger. I mean, some of them I've seen, as large as like 256 gigs, even larger than that, depending on kind of maybe the largest analysis file needed in memory. Sometimes, again, back to kind of if you have to do this beforehand, if you have to do it before you have an environment just starting out, again, these are the things that play into how big to start out a system. Users, total number of users, concurrent users, how many applications you're going to have, size of the data. Again, like I said, it's hard to get that estimate from that, and then whether data can be shared or not. So one of the things that also plays into scaling is caching. Can you cache the data? As you've mentioned before, you can cache in scheduled updates. You can cache in the Spotfire library, so you can embed data in the analysis files, or you can use what we call the SBDF caching, the Spotfire binary data format. You can use automation services to automate those pieces. It's caching in the web player. Obviously, the data is already in memory. It's already right there. The user logs in. They use it. This data. If you're using stuff from the Spotfire library, it may take a little bit longer to load, but it's already local to the Spotfire environment. So that can be an improvement depending on where the data source is, how long it takes to load data, things like that from the data source. You can also cache to disk, information links to disk, and then Spotfire Advanced Data Services has advanced caching and other optimizations. This next slide kind of puts in words what I just said, so I'm not going to go through it in detail. But so one of last things we're going to look at is so Spotfire web plays the resource pools. So this allows you to separate resource pools by various, by ad hoc versus critical. You can balance analyses across machines. This also allows you to scale the environment out pretty easily. You can also typically with larger customers, I'll suggest that they have resource pools to group the same type of analyses together. So by usage, data size, or criticality, things like that. I see there's a question. I actually have some slides about scaling Terra and Python nodes, but you don't necessarily need to scale Terra and Python the same as you do web player, because it depends on how many users you're using it and the types of scripts that they're using. But I have a couple slides that we should have time to get to that kind of talk about performance and sizing of Terra and Python. So let's briefly go through. We'll go back to scheduling and routing. So this is kind of where you, well, first off, we got nodes and services. This is where you set up. So I have 2 nodes in this environment. They're both on a different resource pool. Obviously, you could have more instances on here. But scheduling and routing, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but just, so this, I have these scheduled on different pools. If I go in here and edit this, just kind of talk through some of the things. So obviously I can, determine which, pool to put it on, or the default routing rule in general. I also have a choice of instances. So there's only one currently available on this pool. But one thing I can do is I can either say, all available, which again would still be one because there's only one right now available. But all available would mean if I added a new one in the future, I'd say I want 2 copies of this analysis file available then. And so you don't necessarily have to, if you're thinking that this analysis one of the things you might be scaling up is maybe, today you only have 50 users using this analysis, but in the future you might have 100 or something like that, and you want to, or 200 or whatever the number is. You might want to split that across instances, and then you could say all available. And again, it would still only be available on one, but in the future, if I add another web player to this resource pool, it would then be automatically scheduled on that other resource pool. But the other thing is about this is, so if I have a resource pool that's got multiple instances and I schedule, so let's say there's 2 instances just for, and I have like maybe 10 analysis files that I'm scheduling on that resource pool. Spotfire Server will try to balance those analysis files across that as far as the number of them. So you might get 6 and 4, some days, or 5 and 5 other days. It doesn't know the exact. It doesn't know anything about the inner workings of the analysis file as far as the memory and CPU it's going to take up. But so it doesn't look at that, but it does, will balance those analysis files across. That's why, I recommend customers, create resource pools kind of based on the usage and the size and criticality of the analyses. That way they can kind of control that. But you could obviously get down to micromanaging every analysis. Every analysis could have its own resource pool and things like that. But that gets really kind of hard to manage in a large environment.
We have another question from Andrew.
Yeah. So yeah, that goes back to the. So typically, if a node has greater than 64 gigs on it, it's better to put another instance on that node than it is to, or you can put another instance on that node. If the web player node itself is has a less amount of memory, like 48 gigs or something, then one instance is probably fine on there. But if you get up to like 128 gigs, it's better to have multiple instances of web player on there, because then it can handle the memory management better. It's just .NET, it does better when it has less memory to manage. So it kind of gives. It also depends on the size of the analysis. So if you have some large analyses, obviously you might need the whole machine, and then you would only need one instance. So yeah, we've kind of talked about tuning the web player. Schedule updates is important. That reduces the load on the web player. Writing scheduled updates to disk allows for faster reload. And then one thing you have to do is, I mean, you can't just set this and forget it. I mean, that's, it's a dynamic environment. Users are going to be coming in, analysis is going to be coming in, being less used or more used over time. So you do have to, kind of review how you're scheduling and routing over time, and then just reviewing the environment. And then, there's a lot of flexibility in this environment, so it's kind of hard to, give some hard and fast rule for everything, but you have to be aware of what's going on in it. So just, so when do customers tend to scale? Again, a new environment, use, information, how precise do I need to be on my scaling, as I was talking about earlier, or the sizing, hopefully you can, have some flexibility, so you don't have to, you can start small and then scale up. Another time to scale is, changes in the environment, new Spotfire now, new reports being deployed, increase in users, increase in, change in how data is being used, data in memory versus on-demand queries. Need to support high availability and streaming data. And if you have performance issues in the environment, maybe I've seen a lot of times customers be going on fine, and then they add a new analysis file, and all of a sudden, something happens because they're right on the edge of the threshold of using up maybe, memory or something, and this analysis file puts them over. So they need to be kind of aware when you're adding an analysis file or adding a bunch of new users. Are you close to capacity? So keeping an eye on the action logs, performance counters, things like that will give you a good idea of where things are. One of the let me just pop back over here to the just because I didn't mention this earlier, but we're monitoring and diagnostics. Click on the web player. One of the metrics that I'd like to look at is the paged in and paged out. So it's okay for Spotfire to page data out. That'll happen. That's fine. That means that data is not needed. The big thing is if paged in is really large. If the percentage of these is pretty close together, or the numbers of these is pretty close together, that means you're paging out a lot of data, and also having to page it back in. So that's just something to kind of look at. Obviously, if your web player's been up for a while, these are cumulative over time. So just because there's a large value in paged in doesn't mean that's bad. If your paged out is also really large, or maybe 10 times, 100 times bigger, things like that. But that's just something to one thing to look at. There's also with Kubernetes, there's automatic horizontal scaling. I'm not going to go into this in detail here, but maybe we'll have a future Dr. Spotfire about Kubernetes and using the Spotfire Cloud Deployment Kit. But within that, just Kubernetes provides it, makes it easier to scale on the fly and look at the metrics and decide when to do that. So the last thing is, there's a question about Terra and Python, and also in 12.5 now the R service. So the analyst users, they use their local services, so they're not going to be using the web. But then obviously the web player, obviously services, they're going to be using the services that are on the machines. So you have to be aware of the concurrent number of users, the data is being sent across the network, things like that when you're doing that. So one of the things, are there long-running Terra Python jobs? So Terra and Python are more CPU intensive, just because typically the number of engines that are started up, so the number of engines startup is the number of engines going out are defaulted to the number of CPUs on the machine. So if you have 4 CPUs on a machine, you're going to have or 4 cores on a machine, you're going to have you'll have 4 engines running. Obviously, those engines, there is they do queue up. Users do queue up on there. So if you're if you have a short running script, then you're going to be able to process more concurrent users than if you have a longer running. If most of your scripts are longer running. So it also depends on what triggers it. Are they commonly triggered in an environment? So is it the the big button on a page that everybody's going to be on and they're going to be clicking it multiple times? That kind of plays into how many Terra and Python services you need to support that, and the size of them. One of the things I've seen, typically not every analysis file has Terra Python script. Maybe that's going to change as time goes on. or again, maybe not every page, but again, that plays into how many users do you think are going to be pushing basically the go button at one time. So obviously, if it takes a second for a job to run, and people are kind of spacing out their work, then they won't run into each other. But if you have a lot of things going on at once, then obviously that will. So yeah, so performance considerations, processor speed, number of processors, server memory, and then the network traffic performance is also important. So when you do create a Python or a char script or a data function, is only send the data you need across the network. Don't send all the data if it's not needed. Only send like a couple columns that they're needed, or whatever it is that you can reduce, because that is going across. It is going across the network to the nodes, the char and Python nodes. But yeah, that's it. There's a couple more questions. Yeah, the Kubernetes deployment. So yeah, there's the cloud deployment kit. I do think a good Dr. Spotfire would be to talk about the Kubernetes. Maybe go through a demonstration of it as well on here. But yeah, I don't have anything. I don't know if there's any other questions or not. But
no, I think that's all the questions. I think we just got one more. Are there videos or articles or other resources for the cloud deployment kit?
No, I don't think there are. I mean, there's just kind of it does make the assumption you already have some knowledge about Kubernetes and about Spotfire, I guess, because it doesn't really talk about the Spotfire side of things either. I mean, it kind of assumes that configuration of Spotfire already. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah, definitely sounds like another Dr. Spotfire session on that would be great. So we can definitely add that to our schedule.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I don't think there are any other questions. But thank you, Peter, and thank you, Athir and Jose. The recording for the session will be in our YouTube channel, as well as parts 1 and 2 from Peter's series on Spotfire and the enterprise. So as always, thank you for being here. And our next session will be next month, the first Tuesday of every month at 11 Central, 12 Eastern. So thank you all. And
thanks, Peter.
Peter.
Thank you.